My friends went missing after our camping trip. I'm the only one who knows what happened. Written by Sublime. The branches crawled up to the heavens, folding over one another, blocking any sunlight from reaching the ground. It was oddly quiet, save for the commotion of my friends, as the common squawks of birds and the occasional rustling of leaves caused by mammals were nowhere to be found. As Max and I were draping the tarp over our tent, Sarah was setting up the chairs, which now circled the pre-made campfire. Penny, meanwhile, sat on a bench, her face shoved into a generic fantasy novel. The three of us exchanged a glance, watching the blonde's lips subtly open and close as she read along the page. She was so engrossed in the book that she didn't notice Sarah slithering up behind her. She grasped Penny's shoulders, causing her to flinch and let out a squawk. She dropped the book, which landed unceremoniously in the dirt, before turning around and glaring at the perpetrator. "Don't give me that look," Sarah chuckled, raising her hands defensively. "You're in a camp with all of your friends, and the best thing you can think of doing is reading a book. Penny, no offense, but that's lame." Penny, who was already fidgeting under the gaze of the group, began wringing her hands together, biting her lip. She turned away, refusing to make eye contact. "I didn't want to come here anyway," she murmured under her breath, her attempts to hide her frustrations less than successful. I let out a sigh, leaning on the opposite side of the bench from her. She immediately tilted her head up, teal eyes piercing through my gaze. "All right, listen, how does this sound? You can decide what we do today." She perked up at that, though her expression was still laced with uncertainty. "Really?" Her voice teetered between excitement and skepticism. "Yeah, really?" Max ushered, trying to give me a look that told me to reconsider my tactic. I simply shook my head, silently telling him that I knew what I was doing. He rolled his eyes and yielded, crossing his arms. "Well, I've always wanted to see you guys hunt." She trailed off, her nails swiping at the bits of dead skin hanging off her fingers. Sarah's face twisted in confusion, tilting her head to the side. "Hunt? Like hunting deer or something?" "Yeah, or rabbits, anything, I guess." Max laughed at the suggestion. "Well, we would have to leave camp for that. Are you sure that's what you want to do? You can't just give up halfway because you're too scared." Penny's face flushed, her hands collapsing in on themselves. No, I won't back out. I want to see." She muttered, her voice a candle's flame compared to the forest fire that was Max's. It looked like she was regretting her choice, but didn't want to prove Max right by getting cold feet all of a sudden. Sarah, eyebrows furrowed, opened her mouth to question Penny's decision, only to be cut off by a thunderous clap. "All right, you heard the boss," Max scoffed, rummaging in the car and producing 2 hunting rifles, one of which he passed to me. Even after how many times I had used it, I still couldn't get over how heavy it was. Its weight dragged me down with it, and I just barely caught myself before it could escape my grasp. "Just so you're aware," I began, propping the firearm against a nearby tree as I grabbed my backpack. "These are pretty loud, so you're gonna want to stay back. It might damage your ears if you're not careful. Not to mention that hunting takes a really long time. Hell, with how quiet it is, I'm not even sure we're gonna see an animal. Oh, and also..." Okay, we get it, Johnny boy." Max interjected, his tone oozing with sarcasm. "Penny's a frail and fragile flower. We'll make sure that no deadly rabbits start, I don't know, gently gnawing on her." Penny's face lit up hot red, Sarah's giggles hiding the girl's mumble of a response. "Let the boys have this one," Sarah attempted to whisper, though her words still reached the 2 of us. It's the only thing that they're good at. I rolled my eyes, slinging the pack onto my backpack before following Max's steps. Is that so? Then I'm sure you can handle yourselves, so I'll be going without. Before I could finish, Penny's shuffling footsteps already reached behind me, her body centimeters away from mine. I could practically hear Sarah's eyes rolling as she awkwardly jogged to catch up with us. It was weird. The woods were usually filled with noise, birds squawking, branches swaying in the wind, and the occasional scurrying of rodents. So, when the only sound consisted of dry leaves crumbling beneath our feet, the grip my fingers had on the gun tightened. Sarah attempted to fill the void with snide remarks, only to be silenced by, much to our surprise, Max. Each hush left her even more flustered, clearly frustrated with having the resident joker taking her role of the responsible one. I thought that this was all in my head, that my paranoia was causing inconsequential details to appear unnatural. That was until I took a look at Penny. Her eyes, the same hue as the sky above, constantly darted to every corner of the forest. Her body seemed to slouch more and more every time, wrapping her arms around herself to block off an attacker. It was hard to tell if this was just how she usually acted, or if she too felt the urge to check behind her every now and then. I slowed my pace, allowing her slower strides to keep up with mine. "Hey, Penny," I greeted, causing her to look up with a start. Her wide eyes seemed to have trouble focusing on anything. I know that Max's comment probably made you a little bit self-conscious, but he's just a jackass. I promise, if you really want to go back, none of us will judge you. Well, besides Max, but then again, he's a jackass. She didn't respond, so I pressed on. Do you want to go back? Be honest, all right? She took a moment to mull over the offer before shaking her head. No, making Max wrong is worth staying. I can handle myself. Despite uncertainty lingering in her words, stubbornness overshadowed it. You know, not in a million years would I have expected your first choice for what you wanted to do to be hunting. I mean, no offense whatsoever, but I always thought that you were squeamish. She laughed, her hands fidgeting with the straps on her bag. No, I'm a fan of biology. I've seen way worse things in documentaries than a dead deer, though I am a little afraid. You know, to see one in person at least. You're the expert. What should I expect? I smiled, rubbing the back of my neck sheepishly. Honestly, not much. Hunting's a lot of waiting around. Like I said, we're probably not going to see any shit. Max's voice rang out across the barren forest, and on instinct, I readied the firearm. There's a wolf, His voice trailed off, the fear that was once haunting his words morphing into confusion. What the hell? Is it dead? I motioned for Penny to stay as I approached the carcass, keeping my gun aimed at it just in case. As I neared where Max stood, the reason for his bewilderment became apparent. The corpse, the body of a young wolf, lay just a few meters away. With how its state was almost perfect, I didn't put it past him to assume it was simply sleeping. However, once I walked around it, the chunk of flesh ripped out of its throat proved that assumption was false. I winced, not because of the fact that I had seen the carcass. I've witnessed animals in much worse states, some caused by my hands. No, it wasn't the sight that unsettled me. It was the fact that it was done to a wolf. If it was a deer or a rabbit, sure, I wouldn't question it. But what the hell would take a bite out of a wolf? The potential answers to that question made me shiver. And I stood up, deciding that this wasn't safe anymore. However, before I could turn to the group and announce it, Penny brushed past me and kneeled next to the animal, studying its wound. "Guys," she murmured, reaching her hands just close enough to where they nearly touched the matted tufts of fur jutting out of the sopping wound. "This bite, I don't know how to say it. It just looks weird. It's sloppy. The flesh, it's all stringy, like whatever took the bite had to pull just to tear the flesh off." She pulled her hands away, wiping it on the grass next to her despite no physical contact having been made. The bite mark, it looks small too. Like a house dog or something. "A dog? Penny, really?" Sarah's sudden aggression surprised the rest of us, and even she seemed to be taken aback by it. Her nails dug into her skin, a flash of fear overtaking her, who was always the most sound of mind. "Do you realize how dumb that sounds? It's probably a wolf or something." Her explanation fell flat. Penny's analysis poking holes in her logic not but a few seconds ago. "What? Why are you freaking out? Why, did you not think that you were going to see a dead animal?" Max's attempt at reassuring her was not as successful as he had hoped. In fact, it only caused her agitation to spike, her words coming out with an uncharacteristic venom. The two conversations barely lasted before Penny's meek voice cut through the argument. "It doesn't have teeth." The statement, as if it were a sentence from a different language, was met with silence. Sarah's already light face now grew as pale as snow, her lower lip barely trembling as she fought back the urge to let her fear show. They're gone." "Well," Max scratched the back of his neck, dark eyes glaring through the carcass in an attempt to make sense of the situation. "Max," Sarah's form now seemed to be quivering, the slightest of touches enough to set her off. Her eyes avoided the wolf with conspicuous intent, clearly attempting to direct her sudden burst of fear towards a different emotion. "This isn't the effing 1800s. You can't say shit like that, dumbass." "Hey," my voice felt foreign, as it was the other three who were carrying the majority of the conversation. Sarah, you're right, but let's not turn this into an argument. I'm sure that all of us are on edge, so why don't we just call it a day and head back?" "Like hell," Max scoffed, his arms crossing over one another. "A wolf got into a fight or whatever. It gets some weird injuries and dies. The end. So what? Missing teeth, a massive chunk of its throat gone, and a bite pattern that's apparently similar to a house dog." I shot back, puffing up my chest in an attempt to at least seem on a level playing field with Max's tall stature. To little success. "You don't see anything wrong with that. I'm just as disappointed as you, man, but I don't want to risk getting mauled over some hunting." His eyes lit with a fire that indicated that this conversation would go nowhere. But the flame was swiftly put out as he sighed. "Fine." His features softened, guilt etching onto his face. "Hey, look, I'm sorry, all right? I didn't mean to be a dick or whatever. Let's just head back." I felt my shoulders sag, the potential fight draining me more than I'd care to admit. "It's all good." I patted his shoulder, a gesture he physically cringed at. This was a bad spot to camp anyway. We should have just gone to the public one, where we didn't have to worry about any predators. "Speak for yourselves." Sarah's usual snark finally returned, if a little forced. "I actually agreed to come camping because I wanted to be mangled by a bear." At this, Max rolled his eyes, though a subtle chuckle still escaped his lips. My attention returned to the crouching girl, her fingers still tracing the edges of the fatal wound. "Penny." No response. She seemed to be completely engrossed in the carcass, teal irises practically piercing through the chunks of muscle and flesh. Only when my fingers made contact with her shoulder did she jolt her head up, narrowly missing my chin. "Look, we're gonna head out, so if you want to stop probing the dead animal, now would be great," I said, and a shade of pink splashed across her face as she rose, dusting her hands off. Before she could even finish muttering her apology, Max stopped once again, bringing forth a groan of irritation from Sarah's lips. "What now?" she hissed, to which Max simply raised a finger to his lips. My heart lurched, expecting to see another carcass or, worse, the cause of the previous one. But as his lips stretched into that shit-eating grin that I knew so much, I wasn't sure if I should have been relieved or even more worried. "There's a deer right there." He pointed, and sure enough, with its back facing us, stood a young buck. Its coat was a soft brown, the occasional splotch of white speckling its hind legs. Its head was buried in the foliage, munching away at the leaves and the shrubbery. As my eyes flicked between the animal and Max, I noticed him already beginning to take aim. Like reading my mind, he held up a hand, stopping me from going on another tangent. "It's not moving. I have a clear shot. The noise is gonna scare whatever animal or monster you guys think is out here away. So let me get the shot off before you start bitching." I knew better than to attempt to wrangle the rifle out of his arms, so I instead looked towards Penny. "Well, I guess you got your wish," I joked, her expression immediately twisted into regret. But you really should cover your ears. It's gonna be really loud." She nodded hesitantly, bringing her palms up and tightening them against her ears. Sarah, rolling her eyes at the display, opted to plug her ears with the tips of her fingers. She leaned in my direction, her voice barely below a shout as she tried to compensate for the soon-to-be ringing. "Are you gonna cover your ears, or do you want to impress her that bad?" Instead of entertaining her jab, I slowly pushed my hand closer to her side, knowing that she wouldn't be able to block it without sacrificing her hearing. Hey, I'm sorry. Jeez." She shuffled away, opting to shove her fingers back into her ears. Max's finger curled around the trigger. Then the percussion of the gunfire shook the ground beneath me. A lack of panicked birds fleeing from their homes would have unnerved me if not for the sight of the deer. Though I was sure that Max got a clean shot through its skull, the animal remained standing, its only movement consisting of its jaw clamping down harder on the vegetation. Max leaned back, the rifle now aimed at the ground. His once steely eyes were now wide with confusion, his dark eyebrows knitted in frustration. He muttered something under his breath, either a curse or a question. Sarah, who had been plugging her ears with a smirk, now let her arms drop to her sides. The fear I saw earlier returned in full force. Her previously pale face was now a ghostly white. "Did you miss?" she squeaked before clearing her throat and repeating the question in a more confident tone. I thought that I landed the shot," Max replied, voice trailing uncharacteristically low. It only became apparent just how silent it was when the eventual ringing faded, leaving nothing in its wake. Not even the sound of my breathing could fill the suffocating void. Why isn't it running?" The question shared by the group only left one mouth, Penny's, as Max and Sarah remained speechless, anxiously waiting for someone to answer. I didn't have enough time to alert the others as I saw Max's shaking finger tighten around the trigger once again. This time, when the shot rang out, a spurt of blood burst from the other side. The bullet tore straight through the skull of the animal, allowing me to see the greenery on the other side. And yet, it still stood. No, even worse, it was moving. The deer's head lifted, rusty marionette strings forcing its mouth away from the vegetation. Mechanically, with little motor control, its body turned. One foot stumbled over the other, causing it to trip over itself. I could hear Sarah let out the breath she had held since Max first pulled the trigger. Her relief was short-lived as the herbivore caught itself, the sudden halt in movement causing a chunk of something to spill from somewhere in its throat. As its face came into view, Penny gagged, hand clasping over her mouth. Its left eye, once full of life, retained not a single trace of color. A gray, lifeless orb bulged out from sunken sockets, tendrils of red snaking from the ends of its pupil. Its right eye, however, was no longer there. Viscera shot out from the hole where its eye once was, brain matter oozing out like honey. Its neck could barely keep its head up. The skull limp despite the deer's attempts to keep its eye on us. All of that would have been enough to make my legs give out and for me to run screaming. But what truly did it was the fact that instead of rows of flat, dull teeth, monstrous fangs lined its rotten gums. Like the blades of a bear trap, they gnashed together, so large and out of place that it forced its mouth to remain open in a permanent, savage gape. Tufts of black fur jutted out from between each overlapping tooth, the strands swaying in the wind ominously. It was the same color as the wolf's fur. Max immediately unloaded the clip into it, uncaring what the string of percussion might do to us. Each destructive explosion caused my ears further harm, my hands doing little to block out the noise. Sarah had already fled from the scene before the rifle could finish its barrage. Still, the deer continued stumbling towards us, each bullet taking a chunk of bone and flesh from its face, but doing nothing to slow its advancements. Feet held by nothing but sinew and tendons dragging across the dirt, the clicking of its hooves reverberating through my ears. Max, realizing the futility of his actions, tossed the firearm at the beast, barely phasing it, before finally turning tail and following Sarah. Penny, seemingly paralyzed, watched the monstrosity approach us ever closer, her nails digging so far into her skin that it began to bleed. Her teal eyes suddenly flicked to mine once my fingers wrapped around her wrist, breaking her out of her trance. I tugged, pulling her forward. Her legs attempted to keep up with mine, but failed, resulting in her white tennis shoes scraping across the muddy ground. The disjointed gallop that followed our every step gradually sped up, the beast seemingly gaining stamina the longer it chased us. I spared a glance behind me, Penny's haunted face filling up my vision. The deer's teeth snapped shut with an audible click, its distended neck pushing out in an attempt to reach us. Just before we managed to reach the campsite, Penny's scream rang out and I watched as the deer slammed its teeth down onto her leg. Blood shot out of the wound like a water balloon popping. The sudden halt of speed caused my body to lurch onto my back. I watched as its mouth opened to slam its jaw shut again. The angle of the bite was unable to make it a clean break. Before the blade-like fangs could clamp down onto her flesh, I reeled the butt of the rifle back and thrust it forward, smashing it into the animal's skull. Its teeth detached from her skin, and Penny, who had already risen to her feet, began limping after Sarah and Max. Before it could recover from the blow, I once again slammed the rifle into its head, this time breaking the skin and sending bits of skull scattering. The deer crumpled to the ground, twitching violently as if attempting to force itself to get up. However, I stuck the barrel of the rifle into the soft entrance I had managed to cave away before firing once, twice, thrice, until all the firearm produced was a pathetic click. The deer's writhing ceased, smoke exiting from the wound as various exit shows littered its body. I scrambled back, turning to see the others stopping in their tracks, staring at me with an expression that I couldn't place. Only when I joined them was Max able to break the silence. "What the F was that?" he demanded, his voice cracking under the stress. I could barely formulate a sentence, the sentiment ringing true for the others. We have to get her to the hospital," I breathed, dragging the base of the rifle along the dirt, attempting to clean off the bits of brain. That thing could have been rabid. We can't risk anything. It could have already gotten into her bloodstream or—" My words died out, causing silence to fill the air once more. I placed my hands on my knees, letting out a shaky sigh. Can someone drive?" "It's too dark." Sarah winced, looking up at the sun's rays, which were already muted as a result of the branches overhead, dissipated to nothingness. "There's at least a mile of nothing but trees from here before we get to the main road. We'd crash." "Okay, does anybody know first aid?" I asked. Sarah gingerly raised her hand, which I nodded at. "Okay, get her to the car and patch her up. Penny, if you feel anything change, and I mean anything, tell us. All right? We're gonna stay for the night, but if you do so much as feel uncomfortable, we're out of here." Penny nodded, her eyes refusing to leave the shallow wound left by the deer. Upon arriving at the campsite, Sarah and Penny both immediately sat down, with the former grabbing the medical kit from the tent. I turned to Max, who was kneeling over the campfire and attempting, albeit failing, to light the pile of twigs. What the hell was that? My voice trailed off as Max shook his head, refusing to meet my gaze. "Don't ask." His head shot up, his glare causing me to stumble back a few steps. "The less we think about it, the less we're gonna have a problem. We just need to get her to a hospital, and then we can forget that all of this ever happened." "Max, drop it." His shout rang out any argument I had, his voice reaching the two. Penny's wide eyes were directed at Max, making frequent stops at mine. Her expressions were akin to a patient awaiting bad news. Fear interlaced her teal irises. Sarah gave Max a silent warning, to which his shoulders dropped. Just drop it, man, please." I nodded silently, turning my attention to the makeshift first aid that Sarah was providing Penny. "How are you?" Penny's head suddenly jolted up in a movement that never failed to startle me. It didn't help that my paranoia was already at its maximum, causing my muscles to tense. "How are you holding up?" I continued once I realized that Penny wasn't going to respond. She barely nodded her head, her eyes growing distant a few moments later. Her eyelids fluttered, attempting to concentrate on staying open. Sarah seemed to notice this as the back of her hand lifted to touch Penny's forehead. "It's not bad, all things considered. I thought that you were burning up, but you just seem tired," she concluded, Penny barely acknowledging her comment. With a sigh, Sarah gently brought Penny's head down to her lap, fingers interlacing with Penny's blonde locks. "We should head to bed now. I think that she's had enough excitement for one day." "Yeah, that's probably for the best," I agreed, noticing that the source of light was now reduced to the dying embers Max was attempting to ignite. "Me and Max will take turns keeping watch. We'll wake you guys up the moment that there's any sun so that we can get Penny to the hospital." Sarah hummed in approval, gently tapping Penny's cheek, whispering something that caused the blonde's form to rise. She was practically dragged to the tent by Sarah, who gave us a small wave before disappearing behind the fabric. Max and I stood in silence, neither daring to make the first move. "I'll take the first watch," he muttered, fingers digging into his pockets as he fished out a cigarette. "Least I can do for losing my rifle back there, right? You can sleep now. I got this." His attempt at humor was half-assed, even by his standards. "Right," I said. Disappointment etched itself into his face as my lack of reaction caused him to sigh. "If anything happens, please wake me up." He nodded, lighting the cancer stick before collapsing onto a chair, his stare fixated on the tree line. I spared him a final glance before entering the tent, which was situated across from the girls' tent. Though the inferior of the two, I didn't pay the jutting rocks digging into my skin any mind. Though the sense of dread I felt in the forest no longer loomed over the air like a thick smog, that still didn't mean that I could ignore the fact that there was something wrong. I was so sure that something was lurking in those woods that upon being awoken by Max, I was half expecting to see his pale face, eyes wide with horror, shaking my shoulders and telling me that something terrible had happened. But all I awoke to was his dull expression, eyelids drooping from exhaustion. "Your turn." By the end of his words, he fell onto the sleeping bag, his loud snoring already sounding off before I exited the tent. The fire, which had already been reduced to a few desperate embers, flickered in the wind as the dying flame miserably fought to keep itself alive. I tossed a few logs onto it before beginning my first trek around the campfire. My body was desperately screaming at me to return to my sleeping bag. However, the encroaching darkness fought off by only the dying fire, and the rare ray of moonlight was all my brain needed to keep my legs moving and my body upright. Or at least I hoped that it would. By the half-hour mark, the butt of my rifle, which had started positioned firmly in my right hand, now dragged across the dry terrain, the imprint of a circle appearing wherever it trailed. Max's shift had seemed to be eventless, but never had I expected boredom to so easily replace any remnants of fear. Eventually, my wandering brought me to Sarah's seat, which sat right in front of their tent. I carefully sunk my weight into it, careful to not make too much noise and potentially wake up Penny. It was quiet, far too quiet. Yes, it may have been the dead of night on a day with little wind, but I still found myself yearning for the chirps and trills of distant insects. Irritation was a preferable emotion to isolation, I figured. Each time my head bopped down, my eyes threatening to close, a howl of wind would pierce through the silence and jolt me awake. The sun was beginning to rise, making up for the dwindling flames of the campfire when I was shaken out of my stupor once more. But this time it wasn't the sound of leaves swaying in the wind, nor was it the snapping of twigs. No, it was wet. Though barely audible, the crude squelches instantly brought me to my feet as I walked to the side of the tent where Sarah slept. "I get that you're hungry, Sarah, but you really shouldn't be up right now," I said, my voice careful not to rise too high. "Get some sleep, all right?" However, the sloshing sound didn't cease. In fact, it only got louder, the faint smack of lips accompanying it. My heart sank and a sudden wave of fear washed over me. "Come on, Sarah. Penny's gonna wake up." Nothing. No response. With an agitated groan, I walked to the front of the tent, fingers clamping down on the metallic zipper. I unzipped the entrance, only for a pungent odor to hit me square in the nose. The moment that the scene inside was made visible, my heart lurched forward, and bile began rising from my stomach. The lack of light did nothing to hide the obscene amount of crimson splattered against every surface of the tent, the source of both the sound and the smell becoming apparent. Sarah's limp body was sprawled out across the inside of the tent, her chest caved in, one of her arms having been torn off completely. Tendons and ligaments hung from her shoulder, bits of skin and muscle still clinging to the bone. My eyes traveled up, catching sight of golden strands sticking to one another, dried blood causing ropey threads to form. Frail fingers dug into the gaping hole, bringing pieces of flesh into her gnashing maw. Eyes once mimicking the sky now glowed a vile yellow, pupils dilating irregularly. My gaze finally descended to where the gauze once sat, where an inflamed yellow wound pulsated. As the realization dawned on me, the form paused, head jolting up like an animal sensing prey. Her neck twisted hard enough to tear her head off, exposing rows of crumbling teeth. Teeth not at all fit for tearing meat. My heart hammered against my chest at such velocity that I didn't hear the percussion of my rifle, nor the sound of Penny's mangled body landing on the ground, nor Max's heavy footsteps as he approached. By the time the piercing ringing blocking my ears faded, his fist had already connected with my jaw, sending me sprawling to the ground. The impact of the blow didn't hurt as much as the sudden shock, which kept me frozen in place. Max immediately got on top of me, his fingers wrapping around my neck as he continuously applied pressure. I could barely point my finger in the direction of the tent and choke out a few unintelligible syllables, but thankfully, he understood what I was implying. The grip around my throat loosened and he looked towards where my finger was pointing. He scrambled off of me, his eyes hesitated, unsure of what part of the situation warranted his attention the most. "Sarah, Penny, John, what the fuck did you do?" I simply shook my head, my hand rubbing where his fingers once were. I didn't. My words barely passed through the aching in my throat, my voice hoarse from Max's assault. "Penny, the deer. It made her like this, Max." I wanted to say more, but the reality of our situation dawned on us, a sudden crushing weight forcing my words to die out. It was too ridiculous. I had already imagined countless scenarios for how we would explain this to the police, and each one of them was less plausible than the last. A mix of a laugh and a cough escaped my lips, the absurdity of the situation taking away the realization that I had just witnessed two of my closest friends die gruesome deaths. Luckily, Max was too busy checking the state of Sarah to pay any attention to my hysteria. Otherwise, I wasn't sure if a punch was all that I would have received. "Oh God," I wheezed, finally managing the strength to push myself off the ground. "What are we gonna do?" Max, who was delicately closing Sarah's eyes, ignored my question. Instead, he directed his attention to Penny's corpse. Its limbs twitched, faint raspy breaths still being drawn despite the hole tearing straight through her skull. "We burn it," he concluded, marching over to me and forcing me onto my feet. "They'll never believe anything we say, so we burn Penny, we bury Sarah, and we return ignorant. They ended up missing after we left them alone, and we had no idea where they went. You got it?" His fingers dug into my skin, my shoulder blade shifting painfully. All I could muster was a pathetic nod, which could have easily been mistaken for a shiver. The merit of the plan outweighed its morals. I didn't need to look up to realize how out of his element Max was. My shoulders ached not only because of the pressure applied to them, but the constant shifting as a result of his quivering. I'll bring the shovel, I muttered, gently prying Max's fingers off of my shoulders. Once freed, I grabbed the tool from the car, returning to the gruesome scene. Who's dragging Sarah? The words felt heavy on my lips, and the moment that they left, a rush of guilt flooded my veins. How could I talk about her like she was just something now? I stared at him expectantly, and he back at me. After a few seconds, he finally sighed, his shoulders slumping. I'll do it. He entered the tent, giving me room to grab Penny's ankles, the one that the wound wasn't located on. Max finally exited the tent, Sarah's broken figure dragging along the ground, blood pooling beneath her. The walk through the forest was silent, neither of us daring to utter a single word. A mixture of fatigue from lack of sleep and the events that transpired caused my vision to blur. The only thing keeping me awake was the feeling of her limbs in my hand. I was so caught up in the daze that I didn't notice when Penny's body began to resist, her fingers clawing at the dirt, desperate to break free. I did notice, however, when 5 bony digits wrapped around my ankle, forcing me back to reality. My hands fumbled for the shovel and slammed the sharp tip down, uncaring who or what the source of the appendage was. There was a sickening crack and a guttural groan that escaped Penny's lips. The limb, its state of rot increasing exponentially, was cleaved clean off, dark, cold blood dyeing the dirt and shovel an inky black. Her other hand came up without skipping a beat, but by the time the decayed fingers were wrapped around my calf, Max was already aiming his rifle. The percussion caused my ears to ring, but the sudden release of weight was worth it. While the idea of burning the body may have seemed barbaric before, I was now more than willing to throw her limp figure into a blazing inferno if it meant not having to see her reanimated corpse move once again. Max, noticing my hesitance to touch Penny's body once again, grabbed her remaining leg, dragging her alongside Sarah. Once we arrived at a far enough clearing, I dug the shovel into the ground and peeled back a layer of earth. The sound of the metal digging into the earth violated the silence that seemed so desperately to cling to this forest. Each shovelful took an eternity, the physical labor only heightened by the emotional toll. By the time I had made a shallow hole barely deep enough to cover Sarah, my limbs were beginning to ache. Max, noticing my exhaustion, grabbed the tool out of my hand. He pointed at the pile of dried leaves, sticks, and shrubbery covering Sarah, silently ordering me to gather more. By the time I returned, arms full of foliage, Max had already finished digging Sarah's grave. A makeshift cross of 2 branches dug into the earth acted as her headstone. I opened my mouth to tell him that marking her grave would only lead police directly to her body, but he must have already come to the same conclusion as his boot reeled back. The cross burst into various splinters the moment that Max's foot connected, scattering the makeshift headstone across the clearing. Without a word, he dragged Sarah's corpse into the hole, the body tumbling down, leaving pieces of red mush stuck to the dirt walls. He kicked the dirt in, her form slowly but surely being obscured. Her face, initially stuck in a ghastly expression of agony, was now calm, almost peaceful. "Why?" His voice cracked once he dropped the last bit of dirt. the mound barely standing out against the rest of the ground. He waited, and once he realized that he wouldn't get an answer, his head turned towards me. The moment our eyes met, I instinctively returned my attention to the pile, where I dropped the bundle of shrubbery I held. I'm sorry," was all I could mutter before dousing her still convulsing body in gasoline. You didn't deserve this. Neither of you did. I'm so sorry." I threw the empty container aside, taking the box of matches from Max and lighting one. My hands held the small flame over the gas-covered pile, but I couldn't bring myself to drop it. To be the one to take her life was one thing, but this, burning her corpse until it was nothing but ashes? The fire managed to reach my fingers by the time Max's patient ran thin. He slapped the match out of my hand, the whittled stick falling onto the tower of branches. It only took a second for the fire to spread from the twig, then to a leaf, then finally to the gasoline. A blast of white enveloped my eyes as a burst of fire shot up, tongues of flame lapping at each other until all that remained of Penny was ashes. The walk back was just as quiet, if not quieter, than the walk to, now that the sound of dragging corpses was absent. I stole a glance at Max. The usually tall and proud figure was now bent over, shoulders sinking and his gaze permanently fixated on the dirt. "Sarah," his voice cracked, the mere mention of her name threatening to tear down his walls. "Sarah and Penny's families are gonna blame us, but we can't say anything. I know it sounds cruel, but we don't have any other choice. If we tell the truth, well, Penny's body is gonna be investigated. Sarah's grave will be found and we'll be taken in. We didn't do anything wrong, John. We don't deserve to have our lives ruined because of that thing, okay?" Though it was a question, I knew better than to respond with anything but a nod. We packed our things as if nothing had happened until my eyes landed on the second tent. Now, with the faint rays of the sun illuminating our surroundings, it became apparent just how much blood Sarah had lost. Crimson speckled every fiber of the tent, bits of muscle still attached to the material. Though the vile stench emanating from the tent filled the air like smog, we still had to take it with us to hide any evidence. Once I finally entered the old beaten-down vehicle, I rested my forehead against the steering wheel, attempting to collect myself before starting the engine. Max sat next to me, slamming the door shut. His gaze was fixated on the mirror, his face twisted into a monotony. His constant blinks were undoubtedly to make sure that what had happened wasn't some fever dream. "John," he mumbled, the glazed look in his left eye returned to mine. "Drive." I nodded, twisting the key into the ignition. The engine coughed to life, only for the gas to sputter out and end in a chilling silence. I twisted the keys once again, and more gas was pushed through the pipes, only for the same result. Max's lips curled into a scowl, and he snatched the keys from me. He repeated the action. However, the outcome was much the same.